The old photograph felt fragile between her fingers, the edges soft from years of being handled. In it, a woman with a kind, tired smile stood in front of a brick building, her arms spread wide as if to hug the very walls. That woman was her mother, and that building was the community arts center, the only real home she had ever known. Now that home was about to be torn down. A letter from the city, cold and formal, had confirmed it. A developer had bought the land, and the wrecking ball was scheduled to swing in 2 months. 2 months to erase a lifetime of memories, of paint-splattered floors and the sound of children's laughter echoing in the hallways. Anya felt a familiar knot of panic tighten in her stomach. This was her mother's legacy, a place built on a shoestring budget and a mountain of love, a sanctuary for anyone who needed a canvas, a stage, or just a quiet corner to be themselves. She couldn't let it disappear. She wouldn't. Her research led her to one name, a name that seemed to be attached to half the new skyscrapers that were changing the city's skyline. Damien Sterling. A self-made millionaire, they called him. A visionary. But the whispers she heard from people who had dealt with him told a different story. They spoke of a man who saw the world in numbers, who valued profit over people, and who had a reputation for being as cold and hard as the steel and glass his buildings were made of. He was the one who held the fate of the Arts Center in his hands. He was her last and only hope. Getting to him was the first challenge. He didn't do public meetings or answer emails from people like her, but he did host parties. Lavish, exclusive parties at his hilltop mansion, a place so grand it looked less like a home and more like a museum. Through a friend of a friend who catered these events, Anya managed to get her name on the list, not as a guest, but as a +1. It felt like a flimsy thread of hope, but it was all she had. On the night of the party, she stood in her small apartment, looking at her reflection. The dress she wore was the best one she owned, a simple dark blue number she'd bought for a wedding years ago. It felt plain, out of place for a world of champagne and diamonds. She took a deep breath, the image of her smiling mother in her mind, and walked out the door. The drive up the winding road to the mansion felt like entering another world. The city lights twinkled below, but her focus was on the monster of a house that grew larger with every turn. It was all sharp angles and glowing windows, a fortress of modern wealth. A valet took her old reliable car with a barely concealed look of surprise. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of expensive flowers and even more expensive perfume. The chatter of 100 conversations blended into a low, constant hum, punctuated by the sharp clink of crystal glasses. Anya felt like an imposter. The marble floor was so polished she could see her own anxious face staring back up at her. Women in glittering gowns and men in perfectly tailored suits drifted by, their eyes sliding over her without really seeing her. She clutched her small handbag, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a tiny, ordinary boat about to crash into a luxury yacht. She spotted him across the vast ballroom. Damien Sterling. He was exactly as she'd imagined, and worse. He was older than his photos, with silver at his temples, but he held himself with the restless energy of a man who was still hungry. He was surrounded by a circle of people, all of them laughing a little too loudly at something he had just said. He had a way of looking at people, a quick assessing glance that seemed to calculate their worth in a split second. As Anya watched, he made a quiet remark to the man next to him, and the man's face fell for a second before he forced a smile. Sterling enjoyed power, and he enjoyed watching people squirm. A cold dread washed over Anya. This was the man she had to beg for help. The thought made her feel sick. For almost an hour, she just hovered at the edge of the room, her courage failing her. She watched him hold court, sipping from a glass of something amber, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. She saw mothers, dreams, and entire communities being crushed by men like him, men who saw buildings as just assets on a ledger. The thought of the wrecking ball smashing through the mural her mother had painted with her own hands finally gave her the push she needed. She couldn't leave without trying. Straightening her shoulders, she began to walk towards him. It felt like walking through deep water. The crowd seemed to part for her, or maybe she just shoved her way through, her eyes locked on her target. The noise faded away until all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She reached the edge of his circle. He didn't notice her at first. She had to clear her throat, a small, pathetic sound that was almost lost in the noise. One of his guests, a woman with a diamond necklace so big it looked heavy, shot her a disgusted look. But Sterling heard. He turned his head slowly, his eyes, a cool, sharp gray, landing on her. He looked her up and down, taking in her simple dress, her worn-out shoes, the desperate look in her eyes. A flicker of something amusement? Curiosity? Crossed his face. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth and calm, but with an edge of impatience. The words she had rehearsed 100 times got stuck in her throat. She took a shaky breath and started talking, her voice coming out louder and more passionate than she intended. She told him about the art center, about the children who learned to paint there, the teenagers who put on plays, the elderly who found friendship in its quiet rooms. She spoke of her mother, of her dream to create a space for everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. As she spoke, the small circle around them grew quiet. People turned to watch, their expressions a mixture of boredom and mild interest. Sterling listened, his head tilted, a small, unreadable smile playing on his lips. He didn't interrupt her. He just let her talk, let her pour out all her hope and desperation into the space between them. When she finally finished, her voice trembling, there was a moment of silence. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, and for a wild, hopeful second, she thought she had gotten through to him. Then he laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a loud, booming, genuinely amused laugh that turned every head in the room. It was the laugh of a man who had just heard the most ridiculous thing in his life. The people around him began to laugh too, a ripple of cruel, easy laughter that washed over her. Leaving her feeling exposed and foolish, he stepped closer, his smile widening. "That's a very touching story," he said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so thick she could almost feel it. "You want a life-changing commitment? You want me to save your little project?" He gestured dismissively towards the grand piano that stood like a white elephant in the corner of the room. "Fine," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You want my help? You want a life-changing commitment? Play the piano and I'll marry you." The room erupted. The laughter was no longer a ripple. It was a tidal wave. It was a sound that pushed her back, that stole the air from her lungs. Faces that had been neutral were now contorted with mockery. Anya felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, burning her cheeks. She couldn't play the piano. She couldn't play a single note. She stood there, frozen in the center of a circle of laughing strangers, the weight of her community's future crashing down on her. The millionaire's laugh echoed in her ears, a sound that would haunt her for a long, long time. She had failed. Completely and utterly. The laughter was a physical thing, a wall of sound that shoved her backward. Anya stumbled away from the circle of gleaming, judgmental faces, her cheeks burning with a heat so intense it felt like her skin was on fire. Each chuckle was a tiny needle, pricking at her pride, her hope, her very soul. She couldn't breathe. The air in the grand ballroom, once just thick with perfume and wealth, now felt suffocating, poisoned with her own humiliation. She pushed through a small group of guests who barely registered her presence, their eyes already back on the main event, the powerful man who had just so effortlessly torn her down. She found a small, dark space between two towering potted ferns, the cool leaves brushing against her arm like a soft apology. Leaning against the cold marble of a pillar, she finally let herself crumble, just a little. She pressed her palms into her eyes, trying to block out the image of Damian Sterling's smirking face, but it was burned onto the back of her eyelids. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through her makeup, leaving a salty trail on her lips. She had failed. Not just herself, but her mother's memory and every single person who found shelter within those crumbling brick walls. The wrecking ball was no longer just a threat. It was a certainty, and she had just handed them the dynamite dot from across the room. A pair of eyes watched her retreat. Arthur, the mansion's caretaker, had been standing in the shadows near the grand staircase, holding a soft polishing cloth. waiting for the right moment to discreetly wipe a fingerprint from the gleaming brass banister. He had been doing this for 40 years, moving through these lavish parties like a ghost. His presence felt only in the polished silver, the fresh flowers, and the perfect temperature of the room. He had seen men like Damian Sterling come and go. They were all the same, loud, confident, and hollow. They collected houses and companies like other men collected stamps, without any real love for the items themselves, only for the value they represented. He had seen their cruelty too, the casual way they dismissed the lives of people they considered beneath them. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the girl's quiet dignity as she stood her ground, or the raw passion in her voice as she spoke of a place that clearly meant the world to her. Or maybe it was the sheer, unnecessary viciousness of Sterling's public mockery. Arthur's gaze drifted from the girl, hiding in the foliage, to the man at the center of the room. Sterling had already moved on, clapping a guest on the back and telling another joke, his laughter booming once more. The girl's pain was forgotten, a momentary entertainment that had already served its purpose. A familiar, weary anger settled in Arthur's chest. It was an old anger, one he had learned to tuck away deep inside, a necessary survival skill for a man in his position. But tonight it felt closer to the surface. His eyes then fell upon the object of the cruel joke, the grand piano. It stood there, silent and majestic under a soft spotlight, its black lacquer gleaming like a pool of dark water. To Sterling and his guests it was just another piece of expensive furniture, a symbol of good taste. But to Arthur it was so much more. It was a time machine. He remembered when it was first delivered over 50 years ago. He was just a young man then, with a mop of dark hair and hands that were meant for more than just polishing and cleaning. His father had been the head gardener on the estate, and the old owner, Sterling's grandfather, a kind man with a love for music, had discovered Arthur's hidden talent. He paid for lessons, encouraged him to play, and often, in the quiet evenings, the old man would sit in this very ballroom and listen to Arthur play, his eyes closed, a peaceful smile on his face. This piano had been his voice, his dream. He had even played for a young woman once, a girl from the village who worked in the kitchens. He played a sonata for her, his heart hammering in his chest, and she had looked at him with such wonder. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. His father got sick, medical bills piled up, and the dream of being a concert pianist faded, replaced by the practical need for a steady income. The old owner passed away, and the new generation, Sterling's father, had no interest in a caretaker who fancied himself a musician. So Arthur put his dream away, just like he put away his sheet music. And he became the invisible man, the one who kept the house running while others lived in it, Mal, watching the girl's silent weeping in the corner. A memory so vivid it made his chest ache surfaced in his mind. He remembered the look on his own mother's face when she had to sell her wedding ring to pay for his father's medicine. It was the same look of quiet, helpless despair he now saw on the stranger's face. It was the look of a good heart being broken by a world that valued gold more than goodness. Sterling's laughter had been the spark, but seeing that familiar, crushing pain was the fuel that ignited the old anger into a quiet, steady flame. He looked at his hands, the hands of an old man, wrinkled and spotted, the knuckles a bit swollen from years of work. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist anymore. But he knew the music was still in there, dormant, sleeping in the muscles and bones of his fingers, waiting. He saw Sterling take a sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the room for his next victim. He saw the guests, their faces already blank, the girl's humiliation a forgotten anecdote. And he saw the piano, waiting patiently, holding all his old dreams and all his silent sorrows. A sense of purpose, clear and sharp, cut through the fog of his daily routine. He had been invisible for 40 years. He had watched and cleaned and polished, and he had said nothing. But not tonight. Tonight, the silence in the ballroom after the laughter had felt like an invitation. It was a space that needed to be filled, not with more noise or more empty words, but with something real. With a story. With his story, slowly, deliberately, Arthur folded his polishing cloth into a neat square and placed it on the windowsill. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. It was him laying down his tools, shedding his invisibility. He straightened his simple uniform, ran a hand through his thinning white hair, and took a step out of the shadows. His old work shoes made no sound on the thick, expensive carpet. He began to walk, not towards the kitchen or his small quarters in the back, but towards the center of the room, towards the light, towards the piano. Each step was a step back in time, a step towards the young man he used to be. The party chatter seemed to fade into a dull, meaningless roar in his ears. All he could see was the gleaming black and white of the keys, a silent promise waiting to be kept. The old man's journey across the vast ballroom felt like it took an eternity, yet no one seemed to notice at first. He was just part of the scenery, a shadow gliding through the light. Anya, still hidden in her leafy alcove, watched him with a strange sense of detachment. She assumed he was going to polish the piano, to wipe away the invisible fingerprints of the wealthy, a task as pointless and endless as her own fight had seemed just moments ago. She saw him pass by Damien Sterling, and for a second her heart leaped into her throat. She expected the millionaire to bark an order, to have the old man escorted away for daring to get too close to the guests. But Sterling was distracted, turning to accept a fresh drink from a waiter. His moment of cruelty already a forgotten trophy. It was only when Arthur placed a hand on the polished wood of the piano bench that the first ripples of awareness spread through the room. A guest nearest to him frowned, nudging her companion. The low hum of conversation began to falter, a few notes of discord in a carefully orchestrated symphony of social climbing. Arthur didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on the instrument before him. He slowly, almost reverently, pulled out the heavy bench, the legs scraping softly against the carpet. The sound was tiny, but in the suddenly thinning air of the room, it was as loud as a gunshot. He sat down. His simple, gray uniform looked drab and out of place against the velvet upholstery. His worn, wrinkled hands rested on his knees for a moment, as if gathering strength or perhaps saying a silent prayer to the ghost of the young man he once was. Damien Sterling finally turned, his expression one of cold annoyance. "What is this?" He started to say, his voice a sharp command meant for security. But the words died in his throat. Because the old man wasn't getting up to leave. He was leaning forward, his hands hovering over the black and white keys. The room fell into a profound, almost painful silence. All eyes were now on this strange, unexpected spectacle. A servant, sitting at the master's piano. It was an unspeakable breach of protocol, a social sin. Anya held her breath, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach for this man she didn't even know. She was certain he was about to be humiliated just as she had been. Then he touched the keys. He didn't strike them with force or flair. His fingers, old and gnarled, settled onto the ivory as if they were coming home. A single, hauntingly beautiful note hung in the air, a sound so pure and full of longing that it seemed to silence the very heartbeat of the room. It was not a performance. It was a confession. From that single note, a melody began to unfold. It was not a complex, flashy piece that a concert pianist would play to show off their skill. It was simple, almost childlike in its structure, but it was filled with a depth of emotion that was staggering. Each note was a word in a story that everyone in the room, despite their wealth and their cynicism, understood innately. It spoke of quiet, rainy afternoons, of a love that was once bright and had since faded into a gentle, persistent ache. It spoke of dreams that were put on a shelf and never taken down again. It was the sound of regret, but also of a strange, enduring peace. The music did not demand attention. It commanded it. It wrapped around the glittering chandeliers and the cold marble statues, filling every corner of the cavernous room. The guests, who just moments before had been laughing at a woman's pain, now stood transfixed. Their faces, once masks of smug indifference, had softened. A woman with a diamond necklace slowly lowered her glass, her eyes glistening. A man talking on his phone quietly put it away in his pocket. The music was stripping away their pretense, peeling back the layers of expensive clothes and social armor to reveal the vulnerable human hearts beneath. They were no longer millionaires and socialites. They were just people, listening to a story about a life, but the most profound transformation was happening in the man who had caused all this. Damien Sterling stood frozen, his drink forgotten in his hand. The color had drained from his face, leaving him pale and shaken. The melody was not just beautiful to him. It was a key turning a lock in a part of his mind he had kept bolted shut for over 50 years. It was his mother's lullaby. Not a famous one, but a simple tune she had hummed to him when he was a small boy, tucked into a bed in a room just down the hall from this very ballroom. He could suddenly smell her perfume, a faint scent of lavender and rose. He could see the mobile of little silver stars spinning above his crib. He could feel the warmth of her hand on his forehead. These were memories he had buried under decades of deals, of takeovers, of building an empire of steel and glass, of becoming the man his father wanted him to be: hard, ruthless, and untouchable. He had forgotten the boy who just wanted his mother to sing him to sleep. Now that boy was here, listening, and his heart was breaking, the old man. Arthur played on, his eyes closed, lost in the music. He wasn't playing for the audience. He was playing for the young woman in the corner who had been shamed, for the kind old master who had long since passed, and for the young man he himself used to be. His fingers moved with a certainty that belied their age, coaxing a soulful, aching harmony from the strings of the magnificent instrument. He was telling his own story of lost love and sacrifice, a story that had, by some strange twist of fate, become the story of the most powerful man in the room. As the final soft chord faded into silence, no one moved. The air was thick with unshed tears and unspoken memories. The silence was no longer awkward or expectant. It was sacred, a shared space for everyone to process the raw, human emotion they had just experienced. Arthur slowly opened his eyes. He looked down at his hands resting on the keys as if surprised to see them there. Then, with a quiet sigh, he began to rise from the bench, his duty done. He had spoken his piece, and now he was ready to return to the shadows. But as he turned to leave, a voice, quiet and stripped of all its usual arrogance, cut through the stillness. "Wait," it was Damien Sterling. And for the first time that night, his voice held not a command but a plea. The single word hung in the air, fragile and heavy all at once. Wait. It wasn't a command barked by a master to his servant. It was a plea whispered by a man drowning in a memory. The entire ballroom, which had been held captive by the old man's music, now remained perfectly still, held captive by the millionaire's voice. Enya felt her own breath catch in her throat. She watched, her heart pounding a frantic, fearful rhythm as Damien Sterling took a hesitant step forward. He looked like a different man. The arrogant armor he wore so comfortably had been stripped away, leaving behind someone raw, someone vulnerable. His face, usually a mask of confident control, was pale and open. His eyes, which had been so sharp and calculating, were now clouded with a confusion so deep it seemed to swallow the light. He walked towards the piano. But his eyes were not on the old man. They were looking through him, into a past only he could see. The crowd of guests, sensing they were witnessing something profoundly private and unprecedented, parted for him without a word. They were no longer a pack of fifas. They were a congregation of witnesses. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the soft background music that had started up again from a hidden speaker, it all faded into a meaningless hum. The only reality in the room was the space between the powerful man and the old caretaker, who had just unknowingly unraveled him with a melody Arthur had been turning to leave. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the music had finally settled on him. He stopped at the sound of Damien's voice, his hand still resting on the back of the piano bench. He didn't turn around immediately. He seemed to be bracing himself, perhaps for a reprimand, perhaps for the dismissal he had expected all along. He had said what he needed to say with his fingers, and he was ready to disappear back into the woodwork, his small act of rebellion complete, but Damien wasn't looking for a confrontation. He reached the piano, his steps unsteady on the plush carpet. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze finally focusing on Arthur's back. For a long moment he just stood there, opening and closing his mouth as if the right words were foreign to him. He, a man who could close million-dollar deals with a few sharp phrases, was utterly speechless. Then He did something that surprised everyone, perhaps even himself. He turned away from Arthur and looked directly at Anya, who was still peeking out from behind the large fern. Their eyes met across the room. In his, she saw no mockery, no power, no amusement. She saw a deep, shimmering shame. It was so genuine and so painful that it made her own humiliation fade away, replaced by a strange and sudden empathy for the man who had caused it. That was... He began, his voice rough like it had been scraped clean of all its usual polish. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time so everyone could hear. That was the cruelest, most foolish thing I have ever done. He was talking to her, but his words were for the whole room. The offer of marriage is withdrawn. It was an insult. To you and to everyone. He gestured vaguely around the room, a flicker of his old self returning for just a second, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He looked back at Anya, his expression one of genuine remorse. I am sorry. Anya could only stare, her mind struggling to process the sudden, complete reversal. The apology, so unexpected and so sincere, disarmed her completely. She felt a knot of tension in her shoulders that she hadn't even realized was there begin to loosen. The laughter from before seemed like a distant echo from another lifetime. Damien turned back to Arthur, who had now turned around to face him. The old caretaker's face was a calm, neutral mask, but his eyes held a quiet intelligence, a deep well of understanding. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't demanding anything. He was just waiting. That song, Damien said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Where did you learn it? Arthur looked at the millionaire, his gaze steady and kind. It's just an old tune, he said simply. A lullaby. My mother used to hum it, then someone else taught me how to play it properly. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The simplicity of his answer carried more weight than any dramatic story could. Damien flinched as if he'd been struck. He looked from Arthur's weathered face to Anya's hopeful one, and a connection seemed to form in his mind. The old man's music, filled with a lifetime of quiet sorrow and enduring love, and the young woman's plea, filled with a passionate desire to preserve a legacy of creativity and hope. They were two sides of the same coin, a value system he had forgotten even existed. A system built not on profit, but on purpose. You came here tonight to save a building, Damien said, his voice growing stronger, finding a new kind of authority, not the authority of power, but the authority of conviction. He was speaking to Anya again, but his words filled the entire silent room. You came to ask for my help to save your mother's legacy. He took a deep breath, as if making a final, irrevocable decision. You will have it. Consider the Arts Center funded, permanently, no strings attached. A collective, almost inaudible gasp rippled through the crowd. Anya felt her knees go weak. She reached out a hand to steady herself against the cool leaves of the fern. Funded, permanently. The words were so big, so unbelievable, that they didn't seem real. It was everything she had fought for, everything she had dreamed of, handed to her in a moment of profound, unexpected grace. A wave of relief so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes washed over her. The wrecking ball was stopped. Her mother's dream was safe. Arthur watched the young woman's face light up with a pure, unadulterated joy, and a slow, satisfied smile touched his own lips. His work here was done. He gave a slight, respectful nod, not to Damien, but to the piano, as if thanking it for one last performance. Then, without another word, he turned and began to walk away. He moved with the same quiet, unhurried pace he had used when he entered, but everything was different now. As he passed through the crowd, people stepped aside not out of indifference, but out of a newfound, unspoken respect. They saw him now. They saw the man who had held the soul of the party in his old, wrinkled hands. He disappeared back into the shadows from which he came, once again the invisible caretaker, but forever changed in the eyes of everyone who had been there to listen. The spell was broken. Guests began to murmur amongst themselves, glancing from the empty piano bench to their host, who now stood alone in the middle of his ballroom. Damien Sterling looked lost, a king who had just given away his kingdom and found a piece of his soul in the process. The party was effectively over. The music had stopped, but its echo would reverberate in that room, and in the hearts of everyone who heard it for a very long time. The weeks that followed the party felt like a dream to Anya. The official letter from Damien Sterling's foundation arrived, a formal document that promised more than just money. It promised a future. It was enough to not only save the old brick building but to repair its leaking roof, replace its drafty windows, and even build a small extension. The threat of the wrecking ball, which had loomed over her like a dark cloud for so long, had vanished, replaced by the bright, noisy energy of construction and renewal. The Arts Center, once quiet and filled with a sense of gentle decline, was now buzzing with life. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust filled the air, mixing with the familiar scent of clay and turpentine. Children's laughter, once a fading echo, now echoed loudly down the newly polished hallways. Anya found herself constantly moving, a whirlwind of activity as she oversaw the renovations, coordinated new classes, and welcomed back a community that had been given a new lease on life. She would often pause in the middle of the chaos, a paint-splattered brush in her hand or a stack of flyers tucked under her arm, and just listen. The sound was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. It was the sound of hope. One sunny afternoon, while the new floor was being laid in the main studio, she went looking for Arthur. She hadn't seen him much since that night. He had slipped away from the mansion before she could properly thank him, and a few polite inquiries had led her to believe he had taken some time off. She found him in what used to be a dusty storage room, now transformed into a small, bright music room. In the center of the room stood a brand-new upright piano, its wood gleaming under the sunlight streaming through the large window. And sitting at the bench was Arthur, his back to the door. He wasn't alone. A little girl, no older than 7, sat beside him, her small fingers hovering tentatively over the keys. Anya stood in the doorway, not wanting to break the spell. Arthur's voice was a low, gentle murmur. "Don't force it," he was saying. "Let your fingers find the notes. Think of the song like a story you're telling your best friend." He guided her hand with his own, his wrinkled, spotted fingers covering hers, and together they pressed a key. A single, clear note rang out. The little girl giggled, a sound of pure delight. Arthur smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners of his mouth. He looked years younger, the weight of his invisibility lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer just a caretaker of things. He was a caretaker of dreams, passing on a piece of his own soul to the next generation. Anya watched for a long time. She saw the patience in his touch, the pride in his eyes as the little girl managed to play a simple, halting melody. This was the real magic, she realized. Not the dramatic performance that had changed a millionaire's heart, but this quiet, patient work in a sunlit room. After the lesson was over and the little girl had run off to find her mother, Anya finally approached. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to," she said softly. Arthur turned, his calm expression welcoming. "Just trying to be useful," he replied, his voice as quiet and unassuming as ever. "Useful?" Anya said, a laugh bubbling up inside her. "Arthur, you did more than be useful. You saved everything. You saved this place. You saved me." He shook his head, looking down at his hands resting on the keys. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just saw a bit of myself in you that night. The feeling of fighting for something you love, with no one listening. I had a voice once a long time ago. I just used it again." He looked up at her, his eyes clear and wise. "The world has enough loud voices, miss. It doesn't have enough quiet ones that speak from the heart." A few days later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the Arts Center. Anya was surprised to see Damien Sterling get out of the back seat. He was dressed in a simple, well-tailored suit, but he carried himself differently. There was no swagger, no air of ownership. He looked almost hesitant, like a visitor to a foreign land. He didn't come with an entourage or a camera crew. He was alone. He didn't come inside. He just stood by the fence, watching the children playing in the yard, their shouts and laughter filling the air. Anya walked out to meet him, unsure of what to say. "I didn't come for a tour," he said before she could speak. "And I don't need any thanks." He gestured towards the building. I just wanted to see it, to hear it. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the vibrant community center. I heard you found our pianist, Damien said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Arthur? Yes, he's teaching now. He's wonderful with the kids. Good, Damien nodded, a flicker of emotion in his eyes. That's good. He took a deep breath. The new music wing, the one we're adding on, it won't be named after me or my family? I'd like it to be named after him. The Arthur Penelagon Music Wing. He looked at Anya, and for the first time she saw not a powerful mogul, but a man trying to make things right. He taught me a lesson that night, about the things that really last. It's the least I can do. Anya felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was the perfect gesture, a quiet act of respect that meant more than any giant check ever could. I think he would like that, she said, though he'll probably say he was just doing his job. Damien gave a small, sad smile. Yes, I imagine he would. He turned to leave, then paused. Your mother, he said, not looking at her. She would be proud. With that, he got back in his car and drove away, leaving Anya standing in the golden afternoon light. She looked back at the old building, now brimming with new life. She thought about the strange, twisted path that had led her here. A cruel laugh, a public humiliation, an old man's beautiful song. It wasn't the fairy tale she had ever imagined. There was no prince, no wedding, no happily ever after in the traditional sense. Instead, there was something better. There was a community reborn, an old man's dream rediscovered, and a powerful man who had remembered how to feel. The millionaire's laugh had set in motion a strange, beautiful symphony. It wasn't a marriage between two people, but a new harmony between three souls, a melody of second chances that would play on in these halls for a long, long time.